let's go. So this is Chapter 4, Estates and Interests in Real Property. This is the beginning of everything that we need to know as we move forward. And we're actually going to talk about the difference between real property and personal property. But we're going to talk about land as meaning the earth's surface, and real estate, also known as real property, also known as realty. We're going to define as the land that God gave us to the center of the earth, to the heavens above, and all things attached by man or nature. That's the definition of real estate. And we know from Chapter 1 that we transfer real estate in New Jersey. We transfer it by deed. That makes us an allodial state. Sometimes when we talk about things that have to do with real estate, we talk about the rights that go along with water, and the rights that go along with flowing water, with water that flows, is called riparian rights. And riparian rights, think of ripples on a stream. And the rights that go along with those bodies of water that have flowing water, ripples on a stream, we have riparian rights. We also have the rights that are associated with larger bodies of water that have high and low tides, that are affected by tidal currents. And those type of lands are known as littoral lands. And a memory key for littoral lands is think of litter on the beach. So the rights you have associated with the beach are littoral lands, and with rivers and flowing streams are riparian rights, littoral rights for the beach. We also define many waterways by act of Congress as navigable waterways. If a waterway is what's known as a navigable waterway, it is owned by the United States federal government. So a navigable waterway is owned by the United States federal government. And interestingly enough, navigable waterways define the boundaries as the mean high tide mark. Other bodies of water or rivers may define the property boundaries as the center of the river or the low tide mark, but with navigable waterways, we define it as the high tide mark. We also have...
Hey Bruce, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you tell me which chapter, because I kind of joined a few minutes late?
Chapter 4.
Okay, thank you.
Chapter 4. When we talk about the rights that go with water, we also talk about beach rights. When I was a kid growing up in New Jersey, the private ownership was for all the beaches in New Jersey. You couldn't go on any of the beaches. And they had a court case called Bayhead versus Matthews. Matthews versus the Bayhead Improvement Association in 1984 that gave the ownership of the beaches along the New Jersey coastline as a public entity. So that means that everybody is allowed to go on the beaches in New Jersey now. So water can remove or add land. Water can remove or add land. So it removes land through something called erosion. It removes land, and it adds land through accretion. And accretion can be two different types of accretion. One can be alluvion and one can be reliction. Alluvion is the slow, imperceptible deposit of minerals or soil by the actions of a body of water that create new land. And as an example, we've created the Mississippi Delta. We've created the Mississippi Delta for New Orleans by that process of depositing soil from the Mississippi River that eventually, over thousands and thousands of years, made the Mississippi River Delta. The other way we can use water to create land is by pumping the water out. So if we remove the water, what's left underneath it is land, and that's called reliction. For instance, Holland, much of Holland is below sea level. And when Holland puts up their dikes and pumps out all the water, what Holland ends up doing is creating land by removing all the water. That's called reliction. And we gain title to land that we've created by alluvion or reliction through the process of accession. A-C-C-E-S-S-I-O-N, through the process of accession. Again, the Bayherd versus Matthews was the battle for beach rights in New Jersey. And before that, we weren't allowed on the beaches. And after that lawsuit in 1984, we were allowed on the beaches. Now, the beaches can still charge you a fee to get on if they have lifeguards. But at least now you're allowed to get on all the beaches all up and down the coast of New Jersey. The next thing we want to talk about is real property versus personal property. Another word for personal property is chattel. Another word for personal property is personalty. Real property is realty or real estate or real property. And we transfer the ownership or the interests in real property by deed. We're in a allodial state. We transfer real property by deed. We transfer the ownership of personal property by bill of sale. So personal property is by bill of sale. Now, real property has the ability to change to personal property. So when you have trees, trees are real property because they're permanent and they're attached by man or nature. So trees are real property. We come in here and we cut all the trees down and we end up with logs. Now those trees are no longer real property. Now they're personal property. And the process of cutting all those trees down, making them into personal property is called severance. Just like you sever an artery when you're committing suicide. Severance means to cut it and release it and make it free and separate. So the process of severance is the way we cut down a tree, make it from real property to personal property. Now those logs are now personal property and we can change them again because now we can use those logs to build a log cabin. And now they become real property again when they make that log cabin. And then we can change it again to personal property by tearing down the log cabin. So we can go from real to personal to real to personal, and it just depends on whether things are permanently attached or not permanently attached. And we're also going to try to find out how we can tell whether something is real or personal property by a couple of different methods. So mobile homes are a special case in New Jersey. Mobile homes are all manufactured with a vehicle ID number. But when you take this mobile home out of the showroom and, here's your mobile home in the showroom, and you take it out of the showroom and you tow it to the trailer park, and then you take off the front tongue. Here's the front tongue here. This is where you tow it. And perhaps you put a foundation around it. That's just a piece of wood there, or this is a fence. These are permanently attached things. Now these trailers become real property. In the showroom, it was personal property. When it gets to the mobile home park, it becomes real property. And one of the unique things about mobile homes is since mobile homes were built with a vehicle ID number, even though they may be real property at some point, if they have that vehicle ID number, they are still governed by New Jersey's blue laws. And New Jersey's blue laws say that you cannot sell mobile homes on Sunday. So you cannot sell mobile homes on Sunday, even though they're real property. Now, when we have them attached by a skirt or a foundation or a set of steps, we have them attached, they're real property. But if we unattach all that stuff and we tow the mobile home out of the mobile home park again, it becomes personal property again. So again, real and personal property can change back and forth depending on method of attachment or some other considerations. Another thing that has a special treatment is crops. When crops are planted, like corn, when crops are planted, they have to be planted every year. And so the doctrine of emblement rights says that things you have to plant every year are the personal property of the person who planted it. And what that means is if you are renting a farm and you plant all your corn, and before it gets harvested, you get kicked off the farm, maybe for not paying your rent or something, you still have the right to harvest your crops because those crops are the personal property of the person who planted it. And that's called the doctrine of emblement rights. And it goes on an old concept called fructus industrius. And fructus industrius means it's the fruit of your labor, therefore you have the right to harvest. And that's crops. And remember, trees aren't crops. Trees are real property because when you plant a tree once, it stays planted. So trees are real property, crops are personal property. And again, a tree gets planted once and it's permanently attached unless you cut it down, therefore it's real property. Now, we have a lot of things that we have to determine whether or not they're real property or personal property. We have a lot of things that we can't be sure. So we have a test for what is real property. And the test for what is real property, the acronym for it is MARIA, M-A-R-I-A. M-A-R-I-A stands for method of attachment, that's the M. Adaptation of the article to the real property, that's the A. R is relationship of the party. I is intent of the party. And A is agreement of the party. So that is the way we determine whether something is real or personal property. And in a moment, we'll look at exactly what things that we have to worry about, whether they're real or personal property. We do have an exception for this, and it's called trade fixtures. So here's a picture of a beauty salon. And one of the ways we determine whether something is real or personal is if it's permanently attached. But in a business, not in a home, but in a business, things that are permanently attached, and we look at the sinks that they have here, and maybe the hair dryers, they're permanently attached to the walls, but they're considered personal property if they're trade fixtures. They're considered personal property because they're used in a business, therefore they're trade fixtures. So M is method of attachment, A is adaptation, R is relationship. Is it a business to a tenant to a landlord in a business, intent of the parties, and agreement by the parties. Those are the tests of a fixture. So method of attachment, how permanently attached something is. So when you're in Home Depot and you're looking at the parts that are on the shelf, those parts are personal property while they're sitting on the shelf. When you attach those personal property articles that were sitting on the shelf to the ceiling, there's a magical thing that happens, and that magical thing is called actual annexation. And what that means is that the building annexes those personal property items and makes them into real property. And that's because of the M in Maria, method of attachment. Once they become permanently attached to the building, they become part of the building. The M for method of attachment. A is for adaptation. Adaptation is that article specifically adapted to the real property. And two of my favorite examples of adaptation are your front door key and your garage door clicker. Now, if you look at your front door key, it's not permanently attached to anything, or your garage door clicker, it's not permanently attached to anything, but because they are specifically adapted to the real property, they're considered part of the real property. And what that means is if you're at a closing and you're buying a house where there's a garage door opener, it is the assumption that you should be getting the clickers because they have been specifically adapted to your house. It's also understood that the seller is going to hand over the front door key because the front door key is actually real property because of adaptation of the article. In Maria, the letter R is relationship of the parties. If they're landlord-tenant and it's a business, then things that are permanently attached and used in a business become personal property. So in my son's restaurant in New Brunswick, the pizza ovens were permanently attached. And so when he went to close that restaurant, Fatto Americano's, one of his two restaurants in New Brunswick, when he went to close that restaurant, the pizza ovens were his personal property, even though they were permanently attached to the building. So as he was getting ready to close the restaurant, he was able to sell the pizza ovens, and then somebody came and removed them. I is intent of the parties. And you need to be very careful with intent of the parties because when you're showing houses in the MLS, it's going to tell you whether they are going to leave certain articles like the washing machine or the refrigerator or the chandelier that's in the dining room, if they're going to leave them with the house. Now, naturally, you would think the chandelier was real property because it's permanently attached. And so the intent of the parties then has to be expressed to protect everybody. For instance, if that chandelier is your grandmother's chandelier and you have no intention of leaving it with the property, you have to specifically express that intent to exclude that real property from the sales by putting it in the MLS. So that's intent of the parties. And then if the buyer agrees to that indication of the intent by the seller, then you have agreement of the parties. So the tests of a fixture, the test to see something is real property, is M-A-R-I-A, Maria. So it's a very, very easy test question. All the test questions are multiple choice with 4 answers. So this is a very, very easy test question. The one that comes up quite often is in your house you have a built-in organ. We know that's real property because it's built in. But there is an organ bench that has been specifically manufactured and designed to slide in so you can play that organ. That specifically manufactured piano bench might be considered to be real property because of the adaptation of the article to the real property. Okay? So again, those are the tests of a fixture, the tests of a fixture. So the next thing, we hit on this the other night also, and we want to hit on it again because it's so important. When you own real estate, you own the land that God gave you, to the heavens above, to the center of the earth below, and all things attached by man or nature. So to the heavens above, you own all the way up to the sky. An act of Congress made it so that airplanes can fly over your house. And by the way, that's why you can't stop drones from flying over your house, because an act of Congress made air traffic not regulable. You own to the center of the earth below. You own the water that passes below your property, but you cannot put a well down under your property and take so much water out that you deprive your neighbors of water. That was a big court case in California a few years back when they were growing almonds, because almonds require so much water in a crop. The big almond growers were taking so much water out of the aquifer that they were depriving people further down of the water. And I think there's a very big international court case going on with the River Nile, with people taking water out of the River Nile and depriving people downstream of that water. So again, it's something that goes on all over the world. We also have something attached by nature, according to a lot of philosophers and a lot of men who wrote the laws in our country, Thomas Jefferson specifically, talking about we have a bundle of rights. And our bundle of rights, another word for this is a faggot. A faggot is a bundle of sticks that's attached by a vine. The Romans, when they would conquer you, would hand you this, the head centurion would hand you the bundle of rights, a faggot, a bundle of sticks tied up with a vine. If you took it, you'd become Roman citizens, and you would pay taxes to Rome. And if you didn't take it, you'd become slaves of Rome. So again, this bundle of rights, if you look at a dime, you take a 10-cent piece, a dime out, and you look on the back of a dime, you'll see a faggot. You'll see a bundle of rights. The bundle of rights is all the rights you get as an American citizen or an American state. And around that is the vine. That's the Constitution holding us together. And there's an axe in the middle that represents the power of the government to enforce that bundle of rights. And if you don't think the government's willing to enforce it, that's what the Civil War was partially about, the rights of the southern states to secede or not. So we enforced not allowing them to secede by the armed forces in the Civil War. So again, your bundle of rights has to do with things like your right to occupy and use a property, to build on it, to grant easements, to mortgage, to mine, drill, or farm, to restrict other people from using it, to give promises or covenants, to exclude others from using it. One of the most important ones is the right to sell or refuse to sell. You have the right to give away or abandon your real property, to rent or lease it, to license, and to pass it by your will, devise it by your will to your heirs. Those are all some of the very basic rights in your bundle of rights. These are very important. Other countries don't have these rights necessarily, but we have it in our system, especially in New Jersey, our bundle of rights, and they go along with the ownership of real property. And what always strikes me as very, very interesting is every chapter in the book is about how we use or what documents we have for each of these bundle of rights. And when you have all of those bundles of rights, then we have fee simple ownership. Now, we can also have government limitations on our bundle of rights. We wish we could do anything we wanted with our property, but we can't do anything we want because we have the government or the involuntary limitations on the ownership of land and real property. And that has a simple acronym, and it's PETE, P-E-T-E. So even though you have your full bundle of rights, you can't do anything you want with your property necessarily because the government has some restrictions. It has police powers. Police powers are things like zoning and planning and building, where they can tell you how big you can build or where you can build or what your uses are. So that's part of police powers. We also have eminent domain. Eminent domain is the right for the government to force you to sell. So again, one of our rights is to sell or to refuse to sell, but the government has the right of eminent domain. And using the right of eminent domain, the government can force you to sell. And the right is called eminent domain. The process by which they take your land from you is called condemnation. And we have a chapter on that, which we'll go over later on, how they determine how much they're going to pay you. What if they only take part of your lot? What if the government does something that makes your land not usable? All those things are part of eminent domain. The next letter in PETE is T for taxation. And we talked about this last night also. You have an obligation to pay real estate taxes on your real property. And if you don't pay your real estate taxes on your real property, they have a tax lien sale. And if there's a 2-year period of holding of your tax lien certificate, the holder may foreclose your property for unpaid taxes. And the last E in PETE is escheat. Escheat is if you die and you don't have a will, you have no will, and you have what they call no qualified heirs. And we have a chapter about heirs, who's an heir. And if no one on that chapter, in the chart in that chapter, is related to you, and you don't have a will, so no will and no heirs, your property goes to the state of New Jersey, and the state of New Jersey pays nothing for it. That's called escheat. So we would like to have our full bundle of rights and be able to do anything we wanted to do with our real property, but we do have some limitations, and those are the governmental limitations, and they're spelled out by PETE, P-E-T-E. We also have contractual or voluntary limitations on the ownership. We have things like deed restrictions, or easements, or leases, or mortgages. These are all contractual or voluntary. In other words, you give your permission for these. You give the bank the permission to take your house if you don't pay them via a mortgage. You give up temporarily your right to possess your real property by signing a lease. You give up your right to keep people from crossing over your property by granting them an easement. So you give up your right to restrict them by granting them an easement. And you might give up some of your rights of what you can do on the property for the future with a deed restriction. Perhaps a deed restriction will say you're not allowed to have oversized vehicles park on the property. And so you give up the right to have oversized vehicles park on the property. Those are all contractual or voluntary limitations. And again, for the governmental ones, there's 4, P-E-T-E. There's 4 major kinds of contractual or voluntary: deed restrictions, easements, leases, and mortgages. So you better be sure that these are both very easy multiple choice questions. The next thing we're going to talk about, and we're just going to define some terms so we know what we're talking about, estates and interests. And we're going to break them up into different ways that have nothing to do with each other, but you just need to know what they mean to understand the next couple of slides we're going to go over. And the first one is present interest or future interest. Present interest is who has all of the rights to the real property right now, and who's going to have all the rights to the real property sometime in the future. Present interest and future interests. Corporal and incorporeal. There's that root word corpse again, which means body. Corporal are things that you can touch or rights you can touch. Incorporeal are things that you can't touch or you can't see, but they're there. That's incorporeal. And then the last one is herediments. A herediment is something that you can inherit. A herediment is something you can pass in your will. And not everything is a herediment. Later on, we'll talk about what's not a herediment in the next chapter, but you can have things that are not a herediment. And we'll find some things right now that are not herediments. Okay, so when we're talking about real property versus personal property, we're going to talk about real property versus personal property. Real property is freehold estates. Real property is freehold estates, so we're going to talk about freehold. And personal property is leasehold estate. So a freehold estate is real property. And one of the characteristics of a freehold estate is that it has an indefinite duration. We do not know how many days, months, or years it's going to last. Indefinite duration and a completeness of the holding of the bundle of rights. So when you have a freehold estate, indefinite duration and a completeness of the bundle of rights. And a freehold estate is real property. We also could have what's called a leasehold estate. And a leasehold estate is personal property. And a leasehold estate is all you're getting is the right of possession for a definite period of time. So a freehold estate is the bundle of rights for an indefinite period of time. That's a freehold estate, and that's real property. And a leasehold estate is you're getting just the right of possession for a definite period of time. And the definite period of time is your lease. So here's an example of different kinds of estates. And again, as we just draw a line right down here, to the right of that line are estates that are personal property, leases, and an estate at sufferance, they're personal property. And on the left side of this line over here, these are all the freehold estates. And these freehold estates are all real property. These are all real property. And we're going to define them a little more clearly in just a second. But again, the main difference, again, is we have a definite duration for leasehold estates, and we have an indeterminable duration for freehold estates. So again, that's one of the big differences between the two. Okay, a leasehold estate, the tenant has the right of possession, and it's for a definite period of time. What is the period of time? It's whatever his lease is. And at the end of his period of time, his right of possession goes back to the landlord. And that's Mr. Roper from Three's Company. So at the end of the lease, the right of possession goes back to the landlord. Therefore, it's called a reversionary interest because it reverts back to the landlord at the end of the lease. It's not an indefinite duration. It's a definite duration, and the duration is the time period of the lease. That's a leasehold estate. And then we have freehold estates. And remember, freehold estates are real property. And remember, a leasehold estate is personal property. It's defined as personal property. And a real estate is defined as freehold estates. And we have three types of freehold estates. Fee simple or fee simple absolute, qualified fee, and life estate. The highest level of freehold estate is a fee simple or fee simple absolute. You have everything for an indefinite period of time. That's the highest level of freehold estate. The next level of freehold estate is a qualified fee estate. So fee simple is the highest level. You have all the rights for an indefinite period of time. The next one is a defeasible fee estate. And it's also known by more than one name. It's a defeasible fee estate, a qualified fee estate, a conditional fee estate, a determinable fee estate, a fee based on subsequent estate, all different words that means you have a freehold estate for an indefinite period of time as long as you do something you promised to do or don't do something you promised not to do. So you do something that you promised to do or you don't do something you promised not to do, and you have a freehold estate as long as you meet those qualifications or those conditions or those determinations. And in those type of estates, my favorite example is in East Brunswick on Hardenberg and Riva. There was a big piece of farmland, and 80 years ago, the farmer in his will left that land to East Brunswick with a conditional fee. So in his will, he said, East Brunswick, I'm giving you this land, but you have to use it for public education. And so for 80 years, East Brunswick did use it for public education. There was an old schoolhouse built on there. And old schoolhouse was full of asbestos and had all kinds of other problems. At some point, East Brunswick sold that schoolhouse to a developer, that big piece of property, to a developer. And the developer was going to build townhouses on there. So what happened was the neighbors hired an attorney, and they went back and they researched the ownership of this particular piece of land, and they found it was a conditional fee. I'm leaving you this land as long as you use it for public education. And because East Brunswick was selling it to a developer to build townhouses, they violated the fee. And therefore, they were at risk of having the property be taken away and given to the heirs of the dead guy. So the heirs of the dead guy would have then gotten the property. What actually happened in this case is East Brunswick backpedaled very quickly, and they ended up building another school building on there and rehabbing the first school building was on there, and they are using the site now for public education. So again, if they would have built townhouses and it was a qualified fee or a conditional fee, they would have violated the condition and they would have lost the ownership of the property by not keeping up with what the gentleman who left it in his will had indicated he wanted to be done. But it's still a freehold estate because it's an indefinite period of time, because we didn't know how long it was going to take for East Brunswick to forget that they had to use it for public education. That made it a freehold estate. Okay, the next thing is a life estate. And a life estate is a very unique mechanism by which when you pass away or when you give somebody property, you can control 1/2 step beyond you giving it away. And what I mean by that is if you have a piece of property and in your will you leave it to your son and you pass away, your son can really do whatever he wants with it if he's just a regular, if it's just a regular fee simple piece of property. But with a life estate, you could control 1/2 step beyond your death, or 1/2 step beyond you giving or selling a property to someone. So what a life estate is when you separate the present interest from the future interest. So in a life estate, you are going to give one person the present interest, and he will have the right to live in the property. He has the present interest. He has the right to live in the property, and he has to pay taxes. He has the right to live in the property, but he has to pay taxes. And he can live in that property for as long as he is alive. He can live in the property for as long as he's alive. But when he dies, the ownership of the property goes to someone else. And that someone else is called a remainder man. That someone else is called a remainder man. So the first guy gets to stay in the property as long as he's alive. And he could even sell it. He could sell the property. He could sell his interest to someone else. But as soon as he dies, then the present interests go to the remainder man. And when the present interests go back to the remainder man now has fee simple ownership again. So this is a life estate, and this is a conventional life estate. It's measured on the life of the person who you gave the life estate to. The remainder man is the third person that's going to get the whole estate when the first person dies. So that's an estate in remainder. We can also have an estate in reversion, where this guy gets to live in the property and he gets to pay the taxes. You are the original owner. You are the original owner of the property. You gave him an estate in reversion. As long as he's alive, he has the right to live in the property. He has the obligation to pay taxes. But when he dies, his present interests revert back to the person who originally granted it, revert back to the grantor. And that's called an estate in reversion, because it's going back to the original grantor. That's called an estate in reversion. And it's going to get even a little more complicated in just a moment. And I apologize for that. We'll get even more complicated in just a moment. Sometimes you can give this person the right to live in the house. They have to pay the taxes, but they have the right to live in the house. But they only have the right to live in the house as long as someone else is alive. Maybe their mother, maybe their father, maybe their sister. They only have the right to live in the house as long as this person is alive. When this person dies, then there is a remainder man. And when this person dies, it ends this person's estate and his present interest recombined with the remainder interest, and it goes back to fee simple over here for him. Goes back to fee simple over here for him. So as you can, this is confusing, I know, but as you can see, the purpose of this is so you can control one more step after you die, what's going to happen with your property, or one more step after you sell it or give it away, what's going to happen with your property. And there's a movie out about this. It's called My Old Lady with Kevin Kline. Kevin Kline inherits a house in France, in Paris. And when he goes, he has no money. When he goes to claim this big chateau in Paris, worth millions of dollars, he finds that there's an old lady living in it. That's why it's called My Old Lady. And the old lady had been granted a life estate by Kevin Kline's father. And that means that as long as she's alive, she has the right to live in the house and she has the obligation to pay taxes. And Kevin Kline here only has the remainder interest, the future interest. So she has the present interest, he has the remainder interest. And when she dies, her present interests are going to go to Kevin Kline, and then he'll have fee simple again. So the premise of the movie is he doesn't even know who this old lady is or why she has this. Turns out to be his father's mistress. And, part of the humor in the movie is like he'll walk up behind her and yell boo, hoping to give her a heart attack so she'll die, so her interest will go to him. But now think about this for a second. In this situation, it's a chateau that's worth millions of dollars. But is it worth as much money if she has the right to live in it until she dies? Somebody from class who understood this as I explained it last time said that's the same thing that happened in the series The Ozarks, because they were living in the house that the Buddy, whatever his name is, lived downstairs in the basement. And the reason they were able to buy the house for so cheap was Buddy had the right to live in the basement as long as he was alive. He had a life estate. He had the present interest. And when Buddy died, then his present interest would go to the owners, and it would combine again to fee simple. So again, this is a life estate, and you might run into these a couple times a year, once or twice a year, these life estates. Because if you're an old lady and you want to give your house to your grandson, how do you know your grandson's not going to keep you out, right? You want to stay in the house, you want to give him the house, but you want to stay in the house. The way you could make sure you're going to stay in the house was to give a life estate to him, give him the future interest, and you reserve the present interest. And that way, you would get to live in the house as long as you were alive, and when you died, the ownership would now go to him because he had the future interest, you have the present. When you died, your present interest would recombine with the future interest, and now you'd be back to fee simple again. I know this is confusing. I understand this is confusing. But again, it's something that we come across. Now, how would you know this happened? You have to look at the deed because you grant or reserve or inherit a life estate, and it shows in the deed. It shows in the deed. Again, the grantor in a life estate gives somebody the rights to live in the house for the life of a specified individual. And if when that specified individual dies, when this specified individual dies, then her present interests go to a third person. That's an estate in a remainder. And this third person is a remainder man. If we do it the other way, where you give that person the right to live in the house as long as they're alive, and when they die, it comes back to the grantor, that's an estate in reversion. That's a life estate in reversion. And it can be done either way. And don't forget, it can also be done where she has the right to stay in the house as long as her grandfather is still alive. When her grandfather dies, she loses the right to be in the house. That's called a pure, P-U-R, atra, A-T-R-A-V, V-I-E, estate, a pure atra V. And in French, pure atra V means for another's life. So she would get to stay in that house for someone else's life. Can you give a life estate to two people like both of your children? So you could give a life estate to both of your children by making them tenants in common with a life estate, but I don't know how you would measure the life because there's two of them. So again, you might have to, it might be a little more complicated to do it that way. So you might be able to, and I'm going to give you my standard answer for things I'm not sure of. And that question is above my pay grade. Talk to your attorney. Because we wouldn't want to give the wrong information to somebody. And I've never heard of that done before, but logically there might be a way to do it. So I just have never heard of that done before. Okay, so the next chapter is methods of ownership. And we're going to try to do methods of ownership tomorrow night, have another short class. This was an important chapter and it's relatively short, but I guarantee you there's going to be questions about the bundle of rights. There's going to be questions about the tests of a fixture. That's Maria. There's going to be questions about the governmental restrictions on the ownership of real property. That's Pete. And they always give you questions about the rights that are associated with flowing water. Remember, ripples on a stream, so it's riparian rights. And they give you the, talking about the rights that are gained through pumping out water, and that's reliction. So all of those are things that typically show up on the test. Remember, trade fixtures, things that are permanently attached in a business that are used in the business, become the personal property of the tenant. I had a building in South Amboy, we talked about it the other night, that burned down. And my building in South Amboy that burned down, the fire investigation revealed that the compressors for the coolers caused the fire. So the tenant in the building, it was a deli with a liquor license, he sued me and said it was my fault the building burned down. But when we got to court and we investigated, we found out that the compressors and the coolers were trade fixtures. And that meant that they were the personal property of the tenant. And that meant that if they caused the fire, it was his fault because those were his personal property. So trade fixtures is a big thing in terms of, remember, trade fixtures is only in a business. And then tomorrow night, we'll do chapter 5, methods of ownership. These are two chapters that there's a lot of questions on the test on. So a quickie version tonight, a quickie class tonight, and we'll see you guys tomorrow night. And again, no class next Wednesday night. Thank you very much, and good night.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Bruce.
Good night. Thank you, Bruce.